Wow, I already drank that whole shape? This light-colored amethyst is the variety called Rose de France. Now, there are several definitions of Rose de France and several different ideas of what differentiates Rose de France from other amethysts. But basically, the distinction is that it's light. So, in the simplest of terms, very light amethyst is often called Rose de France Amethyst. The darker colors are called amethyst or different varieties of amethyst. The good news is that Rose de France is generally less expensive than the darker, richer varieties of amethyst. And that makes Rose de France an affordable option to test cut designs in. And yes, I guess I should note that amethyst is a variety of quartz. This piece weighs in at a whopping 138 carats, but even at that size, the price isn't crazy expensive, so I will use this piece of rough to cut the very popular Spellbound design. I'll need to take this piece of Rose de France to my trim saw and preform it a bit, but first let's talk about the Spellbound design. Every once in a blue moon, some creative gem fastening designer creates a smash hit that just cuts a breathtaking gemstone that every cutter wants to cut. And at the end of 2019, our friend Jeff Rhonemus knocked one out of the ballpark with his design that he calls Spellbound. Here are some examples of gemstones that Jeff has cut using his Spellbound design. Jeff did put the rectangle and square versions of his Spellbound design onto his Facebook page for cutters to use, and you can get the cutting instructions there from Jeff on his Facebook page. Jeff recommends this design be cut in lightly saturated gem material, and his personal favorite gem material to cut the Spellbound in are quartz, Oregon sunstone, and topaz. Now, I have a version of Jeff's Spellbound design already in the .gcs format so that I can use it in my GemCut Studio software, which I needed because I will have to tweak the length to width ratio of this design for a special stone that I want to cut in the near future, but more about that later. Again, this design was put into GCS, but the angles and the cutting instructions were not changed, so you can see the design here or go either to the photos section of Jeff's Facebook page or his posts for the PDF version. Many, and I mean many, of my fellow cutters have cut a gemstone using Jeff's Spellbound design, and they have all raved about the final gemstone. So I have had this design on my to-cut list for a while, and I'm excited about finally being able to cut it. I think Rose de France will work great with this design because it's a light colored gemstone. So let's find out. I took my large chunk of Rose de France rough to my trim saw and trimmed it up a bit, and then I used a 140 grit topper lap on my fasting machine, and by hand I preformed my Rose de France into generally the shape of the Spellbound design. That saves a lot of time on the fasting machine grinding the rough into shape later. My refractol liquid, which has about the same refractive index as quartz, allows me to look inside of my piece of Rose de France, which again is quartz. You can see that my Rose de France has only a few inclusions, and they're near the surface where they'll be cut away as I turn this rough into a gemstone. So I can expect the final gemstone to be clean. Okay, I've changed the order of cutting and polishing my version of the Spellbound. And it's no big deal. I mean, everybody cuts their own way. So for me, I think the better way for me to approach this gemstone is to cut and polish the second line of instruction, which are the facets that go to a permanent center point. I polish those before I do the first line of instruction, which are the frosted facets that go in between each of these polished facets and also makes that permanent center point. But first, of course, I set the length and width of our stone. So now I'm going to do the frosted facets, which are the first line of instruction. I'm going to do those second. And from there, I will then go down and work on the corner girdles because they're supposed to touch the width and be the same width as the frosted facet that comes down from the top center point at each of these 4 corners. So the third thing will be to set the corner girdles, and then I can then I just have to level the girdle. And leveling these corner girdles, I'll probably do that last because they're such a small facet, it's too easy to overcut. But then leveling the girdles on the length side and the width side, I just bring those down to where they touch, to where the corner girdle touches our frosted facet is where I bring these down to touch. So that's the order I'm going to approach this at. And again, everybody does their own way. I don't think there's a right or wrong way, but it just makes more sense to me. I think it'll help me line things up a little better. So let me go ahead and continue to work on the pavilion of our Spellbound. Okay, I finished frosting the facets for our Spellbound. So now the next step that I'm going to do, again, there's no right or wrong. It's no problem at all. But I'm going to go and work on the corner facets and bring this one up so that it touches right there at the outside of this facet, and the other part of our corner girdle touches this part of the facet. So coming along nicely. Okay, I've cut and polished the corner 90-degree angle, the girdle facets. So now what I'll do to finish up is I'll go to the 24 and 72, not the girdle, but the line of instruction number 5, which is this angle here, this facet, and I'll walk that down to where it just touches this corner facet right there. So I'll walk that down to right there, and then I'll polish those 2 facets. Then there's a tiny little facet right here. You see how it's kind of at an angle? Well, right there, you cut it to level the girdle. They're very tiny facets. I'll just polish those 4 in on each corner, and then with that being leveled, the girdle, I'll be able to go to the line of instruction number 8, the 96 and 48 side facets here, and walk those down until they just meet the new facet line that I create when I clean up when I polish in that facet on the corner. And then I'll be done with the pavilion, and we'll see how it looks. Okay, for the facets that are the number 7 line of instructions for the pavilion, that's this little triangle right there. And it just levels this girdle up. It's a very, very small facet. So I would do that one last. I just preformed it with my 8000 grit diamond on the zinc laps. At first I touched that, and then I'll go to a quick polish with my cerium oxide. It's a very small facet. Don't cut it earlier or you're going to overcut it, would be my advice. Finished polishing the pavilion of our stone, and now I'll transfer it so I can cut the upper half. So a lot of times when I'm showing my stone, I will use some canned air, any canned air, to kind of blow off any of the lint from the stone. There'll still be fingerprints on it, maybe. I try to clean that off as best I can, but you may see some smudges. But I used canned air to get most of the lint and stuff off of the stone whenever I'm photographing it. And just a tip, this end piece that you stick in there, a lot of times it'll just blow out if you put pull the trigger all the way in. So what I do is I super glue it in there. Just a tip, that way it stays in place whenever you're using the canned air. I'd recommend using canned air when you're looking at your stones. I've pre-polished our Rose de France with 13,000 grit diamond on a bat lap. It's got a nice pre-polish, no scratches. And so now I'll go to polish with my creamway and cerium oxide. Our Rose de France polished right up with cerium oxide and the creamway lap. So now I'll set up my stone so that I can cut and polish the table, and we'll be done with our stone and take a look at it. I finished polishing the table of our Rose de France gemstone. So now I will soak it in the acetone, remove it from the top. We'll be able to weigh it, measure it, take a look at it. I'm anxious to see how it looks. Earlier I mentioned that I had an idea as I was working on this Rose de France in the Spellbound design for a very special piece of gem rough to cut into this same Spellbound design. Now this is a piece of lab created red beryl, which is also called bixbite and is very, very rare in nature and unheard of in this size. So this piece of rough was created by the hydrothermal method, which requires a kind of a seed for the beryl to grow on. And for some unknown reason, the lab used a slice of green emerald as the seed for this red beryl. And the result was this, well, green line that you see in the middle. It's kind of a unique piece of rough, so I bought it a while back and I've just been hanging on to it, not sure what to do with it. But I was thinking, if I align that green line along the middle of the Spellbound design, wouldn't that make a kind of unique gemstone? So I think I'll give it a try. Now, since this rough is relatively small relative to my big hunk of Rose de France, I do need to cut this piece into a calibrated size, and the length to width ratio of Jeff's design is 1.5 to 1. So that won't work with this piece of rough. So that's why I'll run it through GCS and tweak the design just a little bit to get a length width ratio of what I need for this future project. So stay tuned and see how my lab created red beryl with an emerald stripe turns out in the Spellbound design in a future video. In this video, I cut a super hit gem design called Spellbound. And I can see why everyone who has cut this design raved about their gemstone. The design definitely cuts a unique design. Great job, Jeff. I like the description that one cutter gave his gemstone when cut into the Spellbound design. That cutter said, "It's like being on Starship Enterprise when it goes into warp speed." It's just awesome to look into a gemstone cut in the Spellbound design. So please let me know in the comments what you think of Jeff's design, and let me know if you've cut this design. And as always, happy faceting, everyone.